Okay, today we are going to look at the chi-square test, and this is the appropriate test to use if we are comparing two categorical level variables. And today I want to determine if there is a relationship between country of origin, specifically we'll be looking at Canada and Russia, and employment status. And specifically, I want to see if there is a difference between Canadians and Russians in their distribution of employment status in terms of self-employment, part-time, and full-time status. So the first thing that I'm going to do is go up to select cases. And this is something I've gone over in the previous videos, so I'm just kind of going to gloss over it. And we're just selecting the two countries that we want to look at, which is Russia and Canada, represented by 124 and 643. We're going to click continue, OK. And we're going to just confirm over here that that is the case. And indeed, Canadians are included in our data set, and and Russians are included in our data set, and everybody else is not included. Alright, so now it's on to the chi-square, and we're going to go up to Analyze, Descriptives, and we're going to select Crosstabs. And the first thing we're going to do is put one of our variables in rows and one of our variable in columns. And our analysis is going to be the same whether we put one variable in rows and one variable in columns. This is really just going to determine how we view the data, both in the chi-square table and also in our bar chart if we decide to select that, which I will have you guys do. We'll just select display clustered bar charts. And I'm actually going to have our country in columns and employment status in rows. I just think that's going to make a little more intuitive sense when we look at the data. Then we're going to go to statistics. We're going to select chi-square, and we're also going to select phi and Kramer's V, and this is going to give us information on the effect size, the degree of the relationship, if there is indeed a significant difference. So we're going to select continue. Cells. So we have observed selected, and we also want to see what our expected results are going to be. And we're also going to select percentages for rows, and we're going to select unstandardized residuals and adjusted standardized residuals. And typically I would just select adjusted standardized, but I think for educational purposes it'll be useful to see the unstandardized residuals as well. And I'll explain some of this in more detail when we look at our tables and our output. So we're going to click continue, and we are going to select OK. Alright, so the first thing we're going to look at is the total number of participants, which is 454. Then we'll scroll down to our chi-square table. And if we go down to this bottom total row, we'll just notice quickly that our Canadian population, or our Canadian participants, is 217, and the number of Russian participants we have is 237. And now we're just going to go through the cells one by one, and we have a 2x3 for a total of 6 cells, and we're going to start with the self-employed Canadian cell and just go through each one of these numbers one by one. So this top number here is letting us know that out of all of our Canadians, 217, 24 of those are self-employed. And the bottom underneath there tells us, given the total number, both Canadians and Russians, who are self-employed, what we would expect the number of Canadians to be self-employed are. And that is going to be 12.4. So roughly 12 Canadians is what we would expect. And if we jump this percentage and skip over to residual, we'll see that we have 11.6. And what this is telling us is what this number represents is simply the difference between our count and our expected count. So 24 minus 12.4 gives us 11.6. And what we want to know is if that number, if that residual is telling us there's a real difference between our count that we got and our expected count. And that's where our adjusted standardized residual comes into play. And for this cell, we have an adjusted standardized residual of 4.7. Now our magic bullet here, our cutoff number, is going to be greater than 2 or less than 2. And if we think about this a little bit, it makes a lot of sense. A 2, if we remember a standardized deviation of 2, or if we're looking at a data set of 2 standard deviations, plus and minus, that is going to include 95% of our data set. And so if we have a number greater than 2, we can say with 95% certainty that there is a real difference, that number is representing something outside of chance. So a 4.7 is certainly above certainly greater than 2. So that means that our difference here between our expected and our actual count of 24 is real. So if we go through each one of our cells here, we can see that every number, 4.7, negative 4.7, 2.9, negative 2.9, negative 5.2, and 5.2 are all greater than or less than 2. Now this is not always going to be the case. Perhaps for our part-time row here, we would see that Canadians' adjusted residual is 1.5 and Russians are negative 1.5. Now what that would tell us is that the difference between our expected count and count for part-time is not representing a real difference, and that our nationality is not actually, or excuse me, we would expect the same percentage or the same distribution of part-time workers in Canada and in Russia, rather. And the one item that I skipped over here was percentage within employment status, and that's just telling us the percentage of part-time workers who are Canadian and percentage who are Russian. All right, so if we scroll down to our chi-square tests table, the only one we're interested in here is the Pearson chi-square. We have a value of 33.5 roughly, and a p-value of less than 0.05, and that's telling us that our chi-square was significant and there is a real difference in employment status between Canadians and Russians. But we're also interested in if this effect is significant, and so we ran a phi and Kramer's V, and the rule here is that if you have a 2 by 2, you want to look at the phi number, and if you have greater than a 2 by 2 and we have a 2 by 3, you want to look at Kramer's V, and they happen to be the same number here, a effect size of 0.272, and I went ahead and searched the interpretation of this number So we're looking at a phi in Cramer's V, level of association table, and a 0.27 is going to fall in this row here, which represents a moderately strong effect size. So that difference is a moderately strong one. And lastly, we are going to look at our bar chart. And it's just always nice to see our data visually represented. At least I think it is. And we can quickly, at a glance, see that Canadians work full-time less than Russians do. They work part-time more than Russians do. And it seems by quite a large margin they are more self-employed than Russians are, who look to be self-employed almost never. So there it is.